Welcome. It's great to have you all here this afternoon for what I hope will be a very good conversation and the first of a great many that are going to occur between now and the spring. Before I get into some of the housekeeping information about the conversation and to give you a sense of where I want to go today, I'd just like to begin, as is our custom, by acknowledging our presence on the lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. While all of us are encouraged to honor the history of the land we live on, I am moved to reflect on my own positionality as the product of a settler culture in another country, recently settled on this land. I reflect on the privileges I experience here in Kingston, the ways in which I've benefited from the colonial project, a project that has its foundations in the exploitation of many nations here in what we now call Canada and around the world for the benefit of my ancestors and myself. And today, especially in the light of the events in Town Hall last week, very upsetting events for many, many members of our community, I would urge everyone to consider their own positionality on this land and to act on whatever privileges we have so that we can contribute to the work of decolonizing our institutions and our minds. I imagine you will want to come back a little later on to talk about the Town Hall poster. This is, after all, to be a conversation about values and about the values that should animate the institution. And this is not, of course, a desirable way to begin a conversation, except in many ways it's exactly to the point. The university does its work in challenging circumstances, and we have issues both within and without our institution that we need to think about as we think about the future for the university as we map it out. Now, if I may, just by way of some housekeeping items. So there's, by the way, for this event, there is no agenda. I'm going to say a few things about what I'm hoping for, and then I'm going to try to draw from you some observations about issues that matter to you, about your aspirations for the institution, about the things which you think I, as a newly returned member of this community, should be addressing myself to, and ways in which we might imagine our future for the university in the next 10 years and beyond. And before we get to that point, I'll say a little bit about the challenges that I think beset institutions nowadays. So there is, as I say, no particular agenda this time. In subsequent meetings or occasions of this sort, I'll probably want to announce a topic. So we might want to have a topic, for example, on research. We almost certainly will have more than one conversation about that subject. Internationalization, student experience, community engagement, those kinds of topics. Depending on what emerges from our conversation here today and at subsequent meetings, we might have more structured thematic occasions, but the discussion, I hope, will always be free-flowing because that's what this is supposed to be. This is not a process that has an outcome envisaged by me, except that what I hope we end up with at the end of this is a more clearly articulated set of aspirations for the institution and a notion of what the key issues are that we need to address to get where we want to go. So please, in the course of the conversation, be free to be very frank, to raise issues that matter. It's important for every voice to be heard. So you'll notice that the event's being recorded, and we'll put it up on the principal's website so people who are not able to be here today can be part of the conversation. And there are also many other ways in which you can contribute to the conversation even if you don't wish to stand up today and talk. There's this little card on the seats. You can fill that in. If you want to come and talk to me privately, you certainly can do that, or have me come and talk to different groups. I'd be more than happy to do that. What I've said is that everything I do between now and the spring will be to advance this conversation. So whether I'm visiting a department meeting or a faculty council or an alumni gathering or the AMS council, I will be engaging in this conversation in an attempt to move us towards articulating our values and aspirations. I said in the letter I wrote that it would be premature to start one of those conventional mind-numbing strategic planning exercises before we know actually what we care about and what this place should represent in the future. So that's why we're doing this, relatively informal and unstructured, but do feed into it any way you can. I'm reachable by email and in person, and I hope that no one will have any trouble getting to see me if they need to talk about this. So maybe I'll just begin then, if I may, by reiterating some of the points that I made in the letter, and then I will really want to be open to hearing from you. We've got some mics that'll go around, and I invite you, when you do speak, just to use the mics for the purposes of the recording in particular. And if you don't mind saying who you are so that I can get reacquainted. It's nice to see lots of familiar faces here today, though, from what is surprising to me, 9 years ago. As I indicated in the letter, I believe it's extremely challenging at the moment, not only in this province, but more broadly, for universities to hold the course according to values that matter to them. These institutions are beset by, everybody thinks they know what a university should be, right? Every member of the public thinks the university has a particular function to perform. Every member of government thinks that. Within our institutions, I like to think there's a consensus in support of a broader vision of what the university is. But these are not easy times, as our funders are establishing ever more narrow criteria for what they want to support in a university. You can look at, plenty of dystopian examples around the world to look at. In the UK system, in which universities don't offer mathematics anymore because it's assumed that not every institution should offer those things, and they should be offered in one or two particular places. So it's an odd time in which the notion of the university as a place in which citizens are broadly and deeply educated to be contributing members of society in a progressive way is under threat. I think we've seen in this province an erosion of the difference between the mandates of the universities and the colleges. Some of you will remember that Bill Davis, when he set up the college system in Ontario, set it up so there would be no confusing the two. And increasingly we see the two sectors merging, and that's not in itself a problem to me. What is problematic is a blurring of the mission. The mission of the college is very specific and skills-oriented. The mission of the university is different. Not that we aren't interested in specific skills, but it is that notion of educating the whole person that is at the heart of our mission. And institutions like this do, I think, have to concern themselves with values as a key part of what we have to contribute to society. So it's a challenging time. So everybody's got an idea of what we should be doing, and I actually believe there's a version of Stockholm Syndrome that applies here, in that everywhere, every meeting I go to, I find universities are parroting the same kind of stuff. And you can understand why. From a pragmatic or an expedient point of view, if your funder uses a particular kind of language for talking about what you do, it might be in your own interest to replicate that language. So I'm an English professor, right? The stuff matters. And no, one should not necessarily embrace a language that is antithetical to our values. So I don't think you can navigate your way through this unless you as an institution, we as an institution, have a commitment to values and an ideal of the university that excites us, that we feel with conviction, that we can argue for with conviction, and that we can want to impart to our students and transmit through our research and the energy we devote to our research. These places have a huge, critically important public mission, and it's not just the contribution of cogs to the machinery of the economy. It is certainly the contribution of people who can be working and productive members of society, but it's a much bigger vision. The quality of our society and our political organizations and institutions depends on us doing our job. So what should we be focusing on? I was thinking earlier on today, what's the question I want to ask you? What do we aspire to? So we'd recently, big deal, we were reaffirmed in the same place in the Maclean's rankings that well, actually Mac jumped over us last year, so we are still in that distressing position, which last year I thought was fabulous, this year I think is very poor. You become very forgetful in these jobs, that's ancient history. But I'm preoccupied with this thing, but where are we in the world rankings? We're in a category 200 to 300 in the Shanghai Jiao Tong, or the Times Higher rankings. We're nowhere in the Times rankings for institutions' contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. This is not something I observe by way of recrimination or complaint, but it's symptomatic of our not having grabbed hold of a place in the post-secondary landscape. Institutions do this, right? I mean, and often very successfully, if not deservedly so. Arizona State University, everybody talks about the great success story of ASU, and it is an extraordinary example of a university reinventing itself. So there's a question. What are our aspirations? What is Queen's, and where should we sit in that? Do we care about the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, for example? Should we think about the way in which we imagine our program as speaking to those things? If the issue is, do we want to contribute to the world? So that was, I think, the fundamental question I wanted to ask you. But there are many others. We are used to describing ourselves as a balanced academy. And I think there is truth. I think at Queen's you can say that that is an accurate description. In a way, it's not always an accurate description of universities. Universities like to talk about themselves as being very balanced. I think it is true here. This is an institution with a good research record and an outstanding record in terms of the student experience here. Is that how we want to continue to be perceived? And if not, how do we want to imagine that? What about internationalization? Those international rankings do take note of your international engagements, research partnerships, mobility of students, mobility of faculty, contribution to bigger global issues, these kinds of things. It seems to me right now we're a bit disorganized from the point of view of how we situate ourselves on the international stage. We don't really know what we want to do. I think most Canadian institutions have had incredible difficulty getting past the idea that internationalization is just about student mobility, mostly inbound with high tuition fees. And that is the model. I would describe that as, Canada's sort of parochial attempt to imitate the Australians, who did this years ago in a much more effectively exploitative manner. So that's dripping in irony, by the way, that phrase. Just so you don't get confused about where I'm going. But Canadian institutions haven't been good at that, and I would say that Queen's at one time was looked to as the Canadian institution that understood international education. There used to be a program here for international educators every year. I think we've dropped from that position of influence. And I also think, like many institutions, and this would include the one I've come from, we haven't thought through what the whole thing looks like. What does internationalization at home look like? Does that involve curricular change that benefits students who aren't traveling? What is the relationship between international students who are here and domestic students? Do we foster a relationship between them, or do we just have them sit next to each other in classes? There's a very distressing statistic a couple of years ago in which international exchange students returning to their country of origin were asked whether they had made a Canadian friend in their time here. And the figure was astonishing. Something like 1 or 2% of students returning felt they had some kind of bond to the country and to the student body they'd come from. Hi. Go ahead. Yeah, pass the mic.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, by all means.
I figured it would be a good spot to get
Look, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Claudia, and I'm a graduate student, Sorbonne. I too come from South Africa, And I'm very happy that you're speaking about internationalization. It's something that I care deeply about as a graduate student here and as an international graduate student here. And it's something that myself and a group of other international students have been trying to get onto the agenda for about a year. Because I think it is great to speak about internationalization and all the wonderful things that come with it. But if you are not looking at some of the structural dimensions of what international students are feeling while at this university and are facing at this university, I think that these goals and ideas of how much we could contribute are being grossly neglected or not seen. You said speak frank, so I hope that's okay. Because I think in my view, graduate students are the core blood of a university in many regards. They're about to become the next academics. They're thinking deeply about the world's biggest issues. And across the university, I think graduate students in general are facing precarity and facing work-life balance issues that are, any supervisor will know that graduate students are putting in more work than study. And not because they are here to work, but because they're here to study, and somehow the system seems backwards. That is even more grossly the case for international students who are having to pay twice the fees, who have no security like other graduate students when they enter their 5th years, but have to pay, again, twice the fees with no security. And this means from day one, when you enter as an international student, you have more pressure on you to finish on time, to get that done. You're being told to curb your enthusiasm. Don't think as big as other students because, you know what, you have to finish in 4 years because of the financial situation. And I'm very thankful that this is on the table and to hear that you are speaking about this here in this forum. And I really hope that there will be a serious conversation about the fee structure that international students are facing across the university and a consideration of what this means structurally for international graduate students. But thank you once again.
Oh, thanks very much. You raised a number of really important points. Yeah, well said. Because I think one of the other topics I was going to say we must come to is graduate studies and the situation of grad students in general, and you raised that as well. But the particular take you gave on international grad students is extremely helpful. For me, the most reprehensible model of internationalization is the one that sees students, graduate or undergraduate, as essentially a way of funneling revenue into the universities to subsidize domestic students or to make up for the underfunding situation in the universities. To me, any approach to internationalization in this university will have to be modeled on an entirely different set of ethics and values. It has to be about the mutual benefit that the student receives and the institution receives, and there needs to be a consideration of that in the whole question of the cost of higher education. At the moment in the province, the prevailing view is that while domestic enrollments at both levels, graduate and undergraduate, are capped, so we have to negotiate how many funded spaces you could have for domestic graduate students as well as undergrads, there is a recognition that the only latitude universities are being given is international students as a way of making up the financial difference. And that is not an adequate basis for making decisions about an educational institution and the work we do in partnership with our students here. So you raised, I think, really critical issues. It's most definitely on the table. My hope is that when we get to the end of the conversation, we will have the outlines of an approach to internationalization that is ethical, that includes a development model, that is not all about the material benefits that accrue to a place like this through having international students here. It's a much bigger issue. And there are also issues of justice and equity that have to be addressed. So thanks very much. And grateful for the interruption because it stopped me in my tracks. So now I can just take some other questions. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Karen Dubinsky. I'm in the History Department and in Global Development
Hi, Karen.
Studies. It's
Good
nice
to see
to
you
see you
again.
again. 7 years?
9.
9 years.
Yeah.
I started the morning with many other people at the Four Directions Student Center, participated in a talking circle, closed my mouth, as professors don't always do, and listened. And I heard incredible, moving, sad stories, insightful stories. I think my 2 takeaways are that the old people in the circle, like me, who have seen racism at Queen's for, in decades. Everybody said this is the worst thing that anybody has seen happen. The young people who were in the room, who particularly in the circle, particularly the Indigenous and or gay and or people of color who were there, are scared. This is way beyond blackface at Halloween and a racist costume party. These were death threats. To call it a racist poster isn't untrue, but these were death threats, seemingly from their neighbors, from other students. So I guess where I go with that is that I think this needs to be a topic, an ongoing topic, not yet one more Queens in the news story, those racist kids at Queens, those privileged white kids. This has to be part of something much more fundamental, and when the investigations, whatever form they take, happen, and when people are found guilty for this, they don't belong here. They got to get out of here.
Karen, thanks. So I'd agree with you. It's the worst I've seen in whatever it is, 25 years in these administrative roles. I haven't seen anything that bad. And it's extremely distressing for all the reasons you gave. So what I will say to you is absolutely, this is an issue that we have to talk about. And we have to talk about it in an open way, and we have to digest the reality of it. The blackface incidents and so on, distressing as they are, end up sort of managed as part of the way in which a university presents itself to the outside world. But this is a fundamental issue, of justice and respect for all people, but also, if we don't address that, we don't actually have a good place for learning and research. That poster and the threat it represents is an absolute antipathy to what we stand for here, or should stand for, which is why we need to be talking about aspirations, and that is relevant. Thanks, Karen. It's great. Please, go ahead.
Tansei Briani Sigasu Nia Nahiwa Sku Satellite Creation Atsinia. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brielle Thorson. I'm a registered member of Satellite Creation, which is over in Treaty 6. And I'd just like to share some thoughts after talking to other Indigenous students and being an Indigenous student, an Indigenous engineering student here on campus. First and foremost, I think this incident is a blessing in disguise. Indigenous students on campus have been saying there is systemic and embedded racism for years. My whole career here at Queen's, we've been saying this, and finally we're being listened to. So I think we need to address those microaggressions just as aggressively as we're addressing this huge form of a hate crime. Those microaggressions and leaving that room for those is what leads to these intense incidents that threat death upon us students. Those microaggressions come from taking down a Métis flag or a pride flag. That in itself is a hate crime. And I think we need to address those when it happens because it leaves room for incidents like this to occur. So having said such, I think it's really important to listen to Indigenous students on campus. I think it's important for allies to amplify those voices. I was also at Four Directions this morning, and it was great to have ally support. But I think in those spaces, allies need to take a step back as well and recognize their privilege. We need to use our voices as I am, come across as white, and I've been dealing with that, my whole career. But by using your white privilege to amplify those voices versus using those spaces to perhaps further that white privilege and the colonial thoughts. So I guess that's a lot to unpack. But I think it comes from understanding those spaces are for Indigenous students and they need to be supported. As a community, we're hurt, but Indigenous students and LGBTQ+ people were the ones that were targeted. Yeah. So my suggestion is the condemnation is great. We need to show that we're against it, but we need action. And I think that could start with mandatory cultural competency training. I think that Indigenous students, we constantly are facing the emotional burden of having to educate our classmates about our history. And to really talk about truth and reconciliation, we need to start with the truth. We need to start with the truth of our colonial history in Canada, We need to start with the truth of what Thanksgiving is. You know, it's these events that continue to perpetrate this colonization virus, if you will. And we need to ensure that we can stop that. And I think that this individual or individuals who perpetrated this act have found that they have a space to use that voice. And we need to make sure that our truth is shared and that we show that community and that those thoughts are not okay.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Thanks very much. And you know, I'm meeting a little later on today with Jan Hill and with Candace to talk about what comes next and what kind of actions are necessary for this. I think you also put your finger on a really important issue, which is this is the responsibility of the whole university to address, but not the whole university has a right to speak to these issues. So that's a complex dilemma that to work through. But thanks very much for your comments. That's extremely helpful and obviously where we need to go. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, please. I shouldn't say questions, by the way. There's room for statements, observations, angry declarations. Yeah.
My name is Shahin. I'm a second-year PhD student in political studies. I express kind of my solidarity with the indigenous students and the allies, against this, like violent attack. But the problem that I want to kind of raise brings the kind of debate to the international student experience here on campus. I'm an international graduate student. So we know that in the province, some universities have already changed their funding, models, right? University of Toronto, Western, Brock, McMaster, the university that you used to work at. And so this plan that you're talking about, that's putting it on the table, we kind of feel it requires some urgency, right? Because we know from our peers, international students, that in the past it was relatively easier to be a permanent resident in Canada, but today it's much more difficult, which means in your 5th and 6th year, you do not enter that extended period as a permanent resident, but still with student visa, and you have to pay twice as much as your peers. So under that stress, most of the students, try to complete their dissertation, but at the same time create some resources of revenue, and it's not easy actually to juggle between the whole responsibilities. So as international students, actually we are starting petitioning about this, and we invite the Queen's community with all its members to support us in that direction. So we demand the university administration reduce the tuition fees to domestic levels and guarantee funding for 5th and 6th year students. Without that, I think internationalization and remaining competitive in Ontario with other universities seems impossible. Thank you.
Thanks. Really helpful observations, and those policy questions are, I think, really germane and ones the university has to wrestle with. I don't think Dean Carter is here. Is Fahim here? Your graduate dean is very seized of these issues and has a particular interest in international issues as well. So I'll work with him. I mean, I take your point about the urgency of this. So it's not just something that we'll sort of get around to in 2 years. No, I hear what you're saying about that, absolutely. Yeah.
Hi, welcome back, Patrick.
Good to see you.
I'm Eleanor Mcdonald, and I teach primarily in the political studies department. I'll just stand up. I think, first of all, I also want to thank you very much for initiating this conversation and for the thoughtful email that you sent out to the statement that you sent out to the university. As somebody who's worked here, so I'm not blocking the camera this way. I wrecked the show. I've taught here now for about 30 years, and one of the things that I have been reflecting on in my research and my teaching is about the need for greater amount of critical thinking, and I'm very much inspired by the work of Theodor Adorno and his last year I gave a talk on his essay on education after Auschwitz. One of the things, he has many observations, but one of them is the need for everybody to be educated in social science, and by which he means by a capacity to look critically at society. So one of the earlier commentators, that might be me, I'm wrecking this twice. Thank you. One of the earlier commentators mentioned cultural competency training, but I think one of the things that I would ask you to look at is whether or not it's possible to have training or education really in critical thinking, and especially critical thinking about what are the ways in which our society and our university can educate people towards preventing or reducing instances of hatred and violence and hostility. And I just think cultural competency is a part of that. Recognizing colonial history and the need for decolonization is part of that, but so are questions around how to introduce greater humanity into our teaching. And I've long been an advocate of smaller class sizes and more intimacy in our educational connection with students. So that's just something I'd like to go forward with.
Thanks, Eleanor. Your mention at the end there of humanity was very close to my heart. I mean, implicit in that letter I sent out was my indignation at the dehumanizing of the whole higher education process. So people lose sight of the whole question of what is the imperative of this? It's human, the realization of human potential. That's what we're about everywhere. And so I'm with you entirely on that. As I said, I think universities are out of the habit of having conversations. We're also out of the habit of talking about critical thinking. It's a serious issue. I don't mind sharing this with you. At my previous institution, we had an incident not as acute as the one in Chaon, but a sort of a geopolitical question came up, and 2 or 3 faculty members came to the Center for Teaching and Learning to ask how they could help students think about this geopolitical question. And it was I think one of the programs in the natural sciences or something like this. And what I was struck by is that even faculty members didn't know how to guide their students in even the most rudimentary way to think through these challenging social and political questions. So I think there are 2 layers to this. One is we have to make sure that that is part of what we imagine as critical to a student's education and formation. But we also have to rekindle it in ourselves, the professoriate, and to assume that whether you're teaching physics or whether you're teaching engineering or English literature, one of your obligations is to cultivate the capacity for critical thinking in every person you interact with. So I'm entirely with you there, Ellen. And in fact, when I think about the big values we need to sort of orient ourselves towards, it's that. I mean, without that capacity, we're just churning out people to perform a particular role in a pre-established socioeconomic structure. And that's not what educators are about, I assume. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name's Hannah, and I'm a PhD student in the geography department, also an international student, but don't worry, I'm not going to be talking about that again. I just wanted to maybe bring up the conversation about where we're having these kind of conversations. Just in terms of, I don't want to make assumptions, but it doesn't seem like undergraduate students are well represented in this room. And it seems to me as though, don't want to make assumptions, but maybe a lot of the issues that we're discussing in terms of racism, homophobia, and sexual assault and things like that do seem to be very prevalent in the undergraduate community. So how can we engage with those conversations with the undergraduate community and maybe places that seem more accessible to them, i.e. perhaps not in these grand rooms with lots of old white men looking down at us on the walls, or by formal letters by email. I was just wanted to open a conversation about that.
No, thanks. Great point. Great point. And in fact, so the conversation will go to students. So there are only 4 formal events like this, but there will be many others. And so I'm working with the AMS to go and talk to the students. And any opportunity I can find, I will take advantage of to have a conversation with students about these questions. And your point's a very good one. Not everybody's comfortable coming into a place like this, let alone standing up. So good point. And the conversation will only be as useful as it is inclusive. So, yeah. Yeah, please.
I'm Nasser Saleh. I'm from the library here. And I don't want to talk more about racism because I think it's a very hot topic now. But I think, from the feedback I'm listening to, I think it's a core issue need to be addressed. I've been here for 12 years, here at Queen's. There's so many talks happening here, even in this room. Equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism. However, I think the problem we have now is the brand. There's a lot of damage happening. 2 incidents happened to me in the past, not racism about me. A few weeks ago, I got a phone call from a friend of mine. He's finishing a PhD, and he's also a person of color. And asked me this question: would you recommend me if I apply to Queen's? I couldn't answer. The question I have now, do you think I will be able to answer in 1 year? And tell him, you know what, you can be welcome here?
Yeah.
The second thing happened, my daughter is in grade 12. She doesn't want to come to Queen's because I work here, for sure. And when I asked her, why don't you come? She said, it's too white. So it's a lot of, I don't know. The brand, is that something we need to keep here at Queen's? Is that something I have to look at this room, I look at this portrait, and I found I belong here?
Yeah.
I mean, we want to help you.
Yeah.
If you don't get us to be engaged and be a part of this culture, we would love to help you with that.
Yeah. Thank you. Well,
I would love to tell somebody, please come to Queen's. At this moment, I can't say it.
well,
Thank you.
thanks. Thank you. Yes, my hope is that you will help me deal with this issue. I do think there's a big question mark over the brand question, and we do need to talk about that because we do need to know not only how we perceive this institution, but how it's perceived by others, and there is a huge amount of negative stuff out there about this institution. So to go to your first question, however, in a year's time, yes, I hope you'll be able to say to that person, yes, come. Because although we can't guarantee you that there's no trace of that in this community any longer, what you can say is that there is a vital discussion of these issues underway. It's being frankly addressed, and it is being actively pursued. In a year's time, if we're there and we're taking action, and the conversation is saying the elimination of the stuff, the alteration of the brand is absolutely fundamental to our future. It is, by the way. So I remember when I was being considered for this job, I did talk to people about how the university is perceived, both inside and outside, and the perception is sliding. Other institutions displacing it, even in areas where we had strength. So we've got a problem. And it is partly tied up with the way in which the institution is perceived in terms of its whiteness and all of those things, and its cultural prescriptiveness. So what I can promise you is absolutely energetic commitment to addressing this question. I can't shrink from asking the questions about the brand, because you're exactly right there. The 2 questions, how are we perceived? And what's the relationship between that perception and the reality on the ground? I wish I could say it's, opposite ends of the spectrum of reality, but it's not, right? So, great point, thanks. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Mona Rahman. So I've been here a long time. I've been here from diapers to degrees and beyond. So my father came as a graduate student in '68.
Yeah.
My father-in-law apparently came in the late 50s from Barbados. My father-in-law forbade his sons from coming to Queen's. My father has had a great experience at Queen's because he came during the former Trudeau's era of multiculturalism. I will say for myself, and it's only for myself, I have never felt excluded from Queen's. That being said, we have to remember that the university, if we look at the history of a university, it started as a hub of knowledge exchange, and we have somehow gotten away from that. So I said I've been here a long time. So my frosh year was no means no year, for those who know what that is. 10 years later, the same incident happened again. I've gone through Gulf War on this campus with the death threats as well. So I've seen the cycle as to which groups are being targeted over the years. And we do, as a university, we have responded to those, and then things get better, and then something else happens. There's a 10-year cycle. One of the problems with the university is that we are a transient population. The students are coming with their own baggage, or like wherever you're coming from, I will blame the big cities, but they're coming with their own views and everything. And somehow, we have lost that approach of being a hub of knowledge exchange. It's okay to have differences in opinion, and you can debate that, but we have to start to listen to each other again. I mean, we did put into place during Frosh Week, after No Means No, we had all these programs in the residences, worked great. We had a lot of good collaborations across campuses between different groups, and then everything was good, so why are we keeping these things? So I think, these things are happening, and they shouldn't keep happening every 10 years, every 5 years to different groups. What we need to foster is that culture, again, of knowledge exchange, of acceptance, of inclusivity, that doesn't rely on which group happens to be the one targeted at that time. It should be a broad culture, and I've been saying this for 10 years now, and I know it's a difficult thing to do, but I think the key first is we need to get that provide this forum where we can have knowledge exchange, and knowledge exchange also within the academic setting in terms of getting different perspectives when you're teaching students, bringing other perspectives into your teaching and when we're educating the students. I can ramble, so I will leave this now.
Thanks. You didn't ramble at all. It was really helpful. So it was related to Eleanor's point, I think. So Eleanor spoke about the power of critical thinking. Here you're talking about the thing that flows from that, which is the capacity to have dialogue and to discuss issues without discussing them from a kind of a point of view of a difference of opinion. It's a reasoned debate. And I think I'd respond to that partly in the way I responded to Eleanor, which is I think we're out of the habit of doing that. And you're right, you go, something terrible happens and then you do it. And then when things get better, you figure, oh, it's not necessary anymore. What I would say, though, is, related to this is the relationship between the university and the world outside. It's an illusion to think the nasty political stuff out there isn't going to come in here. It's not a cloister. It's not a monastic institute. It's a public institution, and the same concentration of objectionable people is to be found in a university as outside of it. So those things, and anytime there's an outbreak of some kind of political friction on campus, there will be external bodies that are interested in what kind of interactions are happening between students around, whether it's Israel, Palestine, or whatever, you name it. So the relationship between the university and the world that surrounds it, to me, is interesting because we do have the potential. We're not insulated, but we have privilege here of a better kind. And the privilege is to say, well, here we're going to talk about stuff. Here we're going to have a debate. Here we're going to analyze things. Here we're going to reason our way through. It's a bit of a mistake to think you'll never have nasty political contention. In the same way, it's a mistake to say you're never going to have undesirable antisocial attitudes expressed on a campus. It's going to happen because it's society. There is the potential, though, for us to model something much, much better. That's why I'm having the conversation. What is that much better thing? Please, yeah.
Because what I've noticed, because I do go to high schools as well, what I'm noticing is that we have
People can hear you, sorry.
What I'm noticing is that before people are coming into university, just with what I'm hearing from some of the teenagers in the high schools, is that discussion that I was very glad to have when I was in high school back in decades ago, it's being suppressed. So if there's a controversial topic, they feel that they're not allowed to talk about it. And I'm wondering if that attitude is coming into the university, which, I mean, we're supposed to be this venue where ideas flow and where we can have these discussions. But if they're not getting this discussion coming into the university, what are their attitudes? And I mean, it's very complicated, I realize, but that's what I've noticed within the high schools. Not all of them, but for some of them, they're not being encouraged to discuss.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the culture at large has lost the knack of, look at our current election, come on, are positions being debated? Not really. Assertions are being made and counter-assertions, but there's no real debate. So there is a problem in the culture at large about that. But, the real problematic in that notion of universities as places of debate is the power differential. It's not everybody's on the same power footing. So, you can't have someone come onto campus with, wildly provocative ideas. And you might find an undergraduate student in the first year who's prepared to stand up and debate this professor. But how likely is that? Because of the disempowered position of the students. So, the University of Chicago rules about this kind of thing are deliberately exclusive of the consideration of power difference. And I think that makes this a hugely complicated conversation. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Patrick. Dave Yoakum, Faculty of Engineering. Just building on that previous comment and, given the incidences last week, excuse me, and some of the comments from our international students, comment, I wonder whether these types of questions should be asked of our admission process and the types of students that we're potentially recruiting and admitting into Queen's and, fostering and recognizing the value of diversity and cultural competence in some of those pieces. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I saw Anne at the back, but I'm not going to put her on the spot just in terms of admission procedures. But so it's a good enough question. You can say, if you look at the demographic represented in a university, either at the graduate or the undergraduate level, there's sort of two ways of approaching it. You approach it through some basic laws. Do you have the rules? Do you have the grades? Are you domestic? Are you international? Do you apply through the UAC and Guelph, and all applications are viewed in the same way? Or do you want to be more strategic about where these students come from? And this is particularly the case if you think about international students. I mean, in most universities in this country right now, the percentage of the undergrad international student body will be around 80% from China, if that low. The students are in themselves perfectly admirable students, but is it desirable for a university which has an international dimension to be so skewed to a particular part of the globe? Where is sub-Saharan Africa, for example, in the international student numbers across the country? Nowhere particularly good. But what I know is that certainly at the undergrad level, up to a certain point, it's not possible to tell where these students come from, because there are plenty of students in international schools in Canada who are visa students, but they apply as domestic students. So that's one. Anne, am I right about that? Yeah. And then with graduate students, it's slightly different, because if a student wishes to come and work with you as a professor, right, you do have an opportunity to know a bit about that person's background. My view is that we need to be thoughtful about what the international profile of the campus looks like for, I think, good educational reasons. There are practical problems in doing it, which is not to say you can't overcome them. At the undergrad level, there's the whole UAC machinery, which at one level develops a kind of equitable playing field for students applying, but on the other is kind of blind to some of these factors we're thinking about here. It's, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting anything.
No. And there's some specific pathways that have developed that I think could be enhanced, absolutely, for admission. And there's personal statement in different ways, and different faculties use it differently. So, but I think that this is an area that we constantly want to explore and improve to increasingly increase the diversity of the class. Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question, though. You look unhappy.
Well, I don't necessarily want to rely on our international student population to champion EDI. I would even look to cultural competency, questions of equity, diversity, inclusivity for our domestic students, and have they thought about that?
At the point of application, you mean?
Yeah.
So sorry, I went to international just thinking about the whole principle of managing an enrollment pool. I suppose to pick up on Anne's point, in some programs there are more tailored application processes where, let's say, students have to write a statement which comes along with their application. And that can be one tool by which you can probe some of those things. This gets to the point I made in my letter, which is, whether we like it or not, this is higher education on an industrial scale. And you can have individual programs into which there is a much more tailored, carefully planned admission process. But the question is, what is practically feasible for an institution with 24,000 students? I take your point, though. I mean, I think, because this is your point, there's stuff that goes on in the schools, the high schools, that predisposes students either to be progressive in their thinking about these things or enlightened in their thinking or not. So if you could reach down and find those kinds of students and bring them in, it would be great. And a useful supplement to doing the work, too, once the students are here. But it's a great point. Please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Allison Cummings, training coordinator in human resources, and my area is intercultural training. So just to counter David, I would hate to write off a kid at 17 or 18. And I think that then also diminishes our responsibility to bring that change about. They're here to be able to deepen their thinking and, to expand their minds, and that's part of our job. So I have a little bit of hesitancy at saying, you know what? Nope, you're not thinking just right yet.
Thanks, Alison. I like the point, because it goes right to the question of what are we here for? Someone shared with me this witticism recently that here at Queen's we make silk purses out of silk purses. And there is, it's witty, but there's also truth to it, right? What is our value if we bring in students who are high achievers in kind of conventional assessment terms, and then we assess them conventionally, and then we graduate them at the end, and we say, fabulous, we've got 89% graduation rate, or whatever it is. So I think it's a good point, because so long as we're doing that, we're not answering the question I put right at the start, which is, what are we here for? When we were founded, so tomorrow, by the way, I think, Karen, am I right, is the anniversary of the signing of Queen Victoria's Charter for Queens. So that was an important day, brought us into being as an institution. And for our earliest decades, this was an institution that sought to bring higher education actually to local disadvantaged folk, right? The history of this institution is very different from the way we're perceived now. I think of Robert Sutherland, who announced that when he was at Queen's, the first black man to attend the university, he always said, I was always treated as a gentleman back in those years at this institution. So it was an institution that in its early years, oddly enough, had a rather different sense of itself than we've acquired in recent years. So I think we need to get back to thinking, in what way does this institution contribute to a better society? And I think your point's a really good one. Taking the already converted and graduating them as the pride and joy of the institution is it's not necessarily central to that mission. We're in the transformation business, so let's not balk at the individuals who come in here. We're here supposedly to educate people in the full complexities of citizenship, local and global.
Time for one more?
Yeah, time for one more.
I feel a large weight. Hi, Jennifer Hosek, Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, and we actually now are teaching intercultural competency thanks to Allison, who's leaving right now. And I wanted to speak to the issue of bunkering that happens because the budget model gets in the way of us actually training students to be well-rounded human beings, and the related problem that the humanities doesn't have enough funding and support so that we're graduating Fachidioten, to bring up Adorno, because the students feel like they don't have the opportunity, even if they want to learn about critical thinking to understand in a social sciences kind of way, they feel like, well, it's a 5-year degree, I can't, and I don't have any support from my professors in my major. So we need to change that in order to become a true institution creating citizens for this country and for the world. And I thank you for your support. I think you seem to be really kind of on our page, and it's really, I'm excited about that.
Thanks. I couldn't have said it better, by the way. So you're exactly right. I mean, my previous institution had a similar budget model, which is then treated as though it was dropped onto the earth as holy writ and can never be negotiated or changed. And the effect of it is to place disciplines into silos to discourage students from branching out. In the same way that you want students in the sciences to have the opportunity to study course in the humanities and social sciences. You also want it to go the other way. Humanities students like myself to learn, become more numerate than I ever was. So, absolutely, you're right. And there are changes that it's possible to make because the budget model is just a tool. It's a complex tool, but it is. And but I completely agree with the way in which you depicted the long-term goal and aspirations of the place. So we will be addressing that for sure. Yeah. Okay, our time's up, but I can take one more question, but I won't think it rude if you get up and stomp out. Please, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm going to propose just a couple of solutions, because I believe with the conversation we should have a little bit of some solutions to the problems that we have. Of all the things that we sign, by the way, my name is Ranbir Singh, I'm from Toronto. Of all the things that we sign to become a student at Queen's, I don't think it's a far stretch to have all students sign a declaration to respect LGBTQ rights and First Nation rights. Maybe get students to look at a tutorial of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in our country and sign off on it. I'm sure you'll have some legal issues with that, but maybe that's something you consult with Queen's legal team. The other thing I see is when you walk on Queen's Avenue, or University Avenue, you see some of the buildings here at Queen's wrapped with the crest, which is great. We have a lot of pride and just visibility just looking at Queen's. Perhaps we should have some of our buildings wrapped with the values that we have as a university. That not only is visibly a safe environment for those that are walking around the buildings, right? But it's reflective of the values of Queen's as well. It's a statement, right? Yeah. And it's something that we're doing. It's some of the practical things to the issues that we have.
Yeah, thanks. Can I just make an observation about that, an autobiographical observation? So in my previous job, it was suggested to me that the university should engage in a branding exercise, and I was horrified, right? Typical English prof, anathema to me, the idea of boiling down the whole operation to a stupid 2-word tagline. But I was convinced that I needed to think about it, and I was convinced by the deans who all said, yeah, we've got to do this. In the end, the exercise became not about branding in a crass sense. It became about naming those values and making those values the tagline, right? And I'm pleased to say I had no complaint from any faculty member about this branding exercise. In fact, people were putting it up on their PowerPoint slides when they went to conferences because there was pride in the values that were being articulated. So to your point about wrapping the values around buildings, you know, I mean, the crest is one thing. There's something about our history and our traditions. Naming the values we stand for is another really important way of advancing the cause. So thanks. And on the other thing, a very good suggestion too. I'll certainly give that some thought. Yeah, please. Anna.
Sorry, I know who want to go. I feel personally it would be somewhat scandalous maybe to not have this discussion without paying tribute to the fact that we are in a climate emergency, and especially when we're talking about, you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals earlier, and now we're talking about branding. Why can't Queen's be the university in Canada or one of the universities in the world that is leading the educational fight, I suppose, for climate change? We have so many people within the geography department and other departments who are doing amazing research. And yeah, I just really want us to foreground that.
I love the idea.
And know that the administration and that you are putting that on the top priority for everything, because there's no point really having any of these conversations if we're not recognizing that the planet is coming to an end. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Hannah. And on that really cheerful note, thanks, everybody. There will be another occasion. I hope you'll come on out.